What if the oldest human language wasn't written in words at all, but in numbers we've forgotten how to read? Picture yourself standing in a cave so deep that daylight has become a memory, holding a torch that flickers against stone walls carved 40,000 years ago. The walls are covered not with hunting scenes or animal spirits, but with marks, notches, sequences, patterns that repeat with an unsettling precision. These aren't random scratches made by idle hands. They're deliberate, intentional, mathematical, and they suggest something that shouldn't be possible. That our ancestors, long before they built cities or planted crops, long before they invented what we call civilization, understood numbers in ways we're only beginning to rediscover. If you're drawn to the kind of history that lives in the spaces between what we're taught and what we've forgotten, consider subscribing. Like this video only if you feel that pull toward the mysteries that academic consensus prefers to leave unexamined. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? What part of the world are you in as you hear these words? We've been told a comfortable story about human progress. It goes something like this: our ancestors were simple. They lived in caves, hunted with stone tools, painted crude images of the animals they killed. Then, slowly, over tens of thousands of years, they got smarter. They developed agriculture. They built settlements. They invented writing. And only then, only after all of that, did they begin to understand mathematics. First came counting, then addition, then geometry, then the sophisticated numerical systems that would eventually give us architecture, astronomy, engineering. It's a clean narrative. Linear, logical, satisfying in its simplicity. It's also almost certainly wrong, because scattered across every inhabited continent, in caves and on cliffs, carved into bone and etched into stone, there exists a body of evidence that tells a different story. A story that suggests our ancestors didn't slowly stumble toward mathematical understanding. They possessed it, fully formed, sophisticated, global in its reach. And then, somehow, most of humanity forgot. The earliest known example is called the Lubombo bone. It was found in the border cave in the Lubombo Mountains between South Africa and Eswatini, and it's been dated to approximately 43,000 years ago. It's a small piece of a baboon's fibula, and carved into it are 29 deliberate notches. 29. Not a random number. 29 is the number of days in a lunar month. This wasn't a tally of kills or a board carving. This was a calendar, a mathematical tracking system for celestial cycles, created by people we've been taught were barely capable of abstract thought. But the Lubombo bone isn't alone. In what is now the Czech Republic, archaeologists discovered the Dolní Věstonice site, where, among the artifacts, they found wolf bones marked with 55 notches arranged in groups of 5. These bones are 25,000 years old. The grouping isn't random. It suggests a base 5 counting system, a mathematical framework, a method of organizing numerical information that predates written language by 20 millennia. Then there's the Ishango bone, found near the headwaters of the Nile River in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's dated to between 25,000 and 20,000 years ago, and it's perhaps the most unsettling of all. The bone contains 3 columns of notches, and the patterns within those columns reveal something extraordinary. One column contains the prime numbers between 10 and 20, 11, 13, 17, 19. Another column shows numbers that, when examined closely, demonstrate knowledge of doubling and halving. This isn't simple counting. This is mathematical reasoning. This is someone understanding the properties of numbers themselves, their relationships, their deeper structure. 40,000 years ago. 25,000 years ago. These aren't dates from the dawn of civilization. These are dates from an era we call the Stone Age, a term that itself reveals our bias, our assumption that the material of a tool defines the sophistication of the mind that made it. And here's what makes this evidence so profoundly disturbing to our conventional timeline. These numerical systems appear fully formed. There's no progression, no evidence of experimentation or gradual development. They simply exist, as if the people who made them inherited the knowledge from somewhere, or someone even earlier. Imagine holding one of those bones now. Feel its weight. Run your fingers over the notches, each one carved with intention, each one part of a pattern that took abstract thinking, planning, and a framework of mathematical concepts to create. These were made by people who had the same brain capacity as you, the same cognitive abilities, the same potential for complex thought. And yet we've been taught to think of them as primitive. What were they counting? Why were they tracking lunar cycles with such precision? What need did hunter-gatherers have for prime numbers? Or perhaps the question isn't what they were counting, but what they were remembering. Because as we move forward in time, as we approach the periods where civilization supposedly begins, something strange happens. The mathematical knowledge doesn't gradually increase in sophistication. It stays consistent. The same base 5 systems, the same lunar tracking, the same geometric principles. As if humanity wasn't inventing mathematics across millennia, but maintaining it, preserving it, passing down a system that had already existed, complete and functional, for longer than we can easily comprehend. The silence of academic consensus on this matter is deafening. These artifacts exist. They've been dated. They've been studied. And yet they remain footnotes, curiosities, anomalies that don't fit the narrative we've constructed about human cognitive evolution. They're acknowledged but not integrated, mentioned but not explained. Because to truly grapple with what they represent would require us to reconsider everything we think we know about the sophistication of early human culture. It would mean accepting that our ancestors tens of thousands of years ago weren't slowly climbing toward mathematical understanding. They had already arrived. And if they had arrived, where did the knowledge come from? The story becomes even more unsettling when we move from carved bones to carved stone, from portable artifacts to the landscape itself. In the hills of southern Turkey, there's a place called Göbekli Tepe. You may have heard of it. It's been called the world's oldest temple, dated to approximately 11,600 years ago, which places it firmly in the period before agriculture, before pottery, before any of the technological innovations we associate with settled civilization. And yet there it stands. Massive stone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in precise circular formations, carved with intricate symbols and animal figures. The conventional explanation struggles here. How did hunter-gatherers, people without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals, quarry, transport, and erect these megaliths? How did they organize the labor? How did they have the surplus resources to feed the workers while they built something that served no immediately practical purpose? But set those questions aside for a moment, because there's something else about Göbekli Tepe that receives far less attention, something that connects it directly to those carved bones from 40,000 years earlier. The circles at Göbekli Tepe aren't random. They're geometric, precisely geometric. The pillars are placed at specific intervals, creating ratios that repeat across different enclosures. The circles themselves form patterns that suggest knowledge of pi, of the relationship between circumference and diameter. This wasn't approximation. This wasn't eyeballing it. This was mathematical planning, executed in stone, 11,000 years before the Greek mathematicians we credit with discovering these principles. And Göbekli Tepe isn't alone. Across the world, in places that supposedly had no contact with each other, we find the same geometric knowledge appearing at roughly the same time or even earlier. In the Orkney Islands off the coast of Scotland, there's a Neolithic site called the Ness of Brodger. The structures there, dated to around 3000 BCE, show sophisticated understanding of geometry. The buildings are aligned to solar and lunar events with precision that requires not just observation but mathematical calculation. The ratios between the dimensions of different structures repeat, suggesting a standard measurement system, a shared mathematical language. In Ireland, the Passage tomb at Newgrange, dated to approximately 3200 BCE, demonstrates the same knowledge. The tomb is aligned so perfectly to the winter solstice sunrise that for 17 minutes each year, light penetrates the long passage and illuminates the inner chamber. This alignment requires understanding of angles, of the Earth's axial tilt, of astronomical cycles, and of the mathematics necessary to translate that understanding into physical architecture. Move to the Americas. In the Amazon basin, beneath the jungle canopy, aerial surveys using LiDAR technology have revealed enormous geometric earthworks, some covering areas larger than modern cities. Perfect squares, precise circles, interconnected by straight roads that run for miles. These earthworks are dated to between 2000 and 1000 BCE, created by cultures we know almost nothing about, cultures that supposedly didn't have the organizational capacity or mathematical knowledge for such projects. The same patterns, the same ratios, the same geometric principles, across continents, across cultures with no known contact. The standard explanation is independent invention. The idea that humans, given enough time and similar environmental pressures, will arrive at similar solutions. It's a reasonable theory. It explains many things, but does it explain precision? Because we're not talking about vague similarities. We're talking about specific numerical ratios appearing in structures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. The golden ratio, phi, approximately 1.618, shows up in the Parthenon in Greece, yes, but it also shows up in the proportions of pre-Columbian pyramids in Central America, in the design of certain Aboriginal Australian ceremonial sites, in the layout of ancient stone circles in England. The Pythagorean theorem, which we're taught was discovered by Pythagoras around 500 BCE, appears encoded in the architecture of Egyptian pyramids built 2,000 years earlier. It appears in Babylonian tablets from the same period. It appears in the layout of ritual spaces in the Indus Valley civilization. Either humanity independently discovered the same specific mathematical relationships over and over again, in precisely the same form, or there was something else. A shared source, a common origin, a mathematical tradition that predated the civilizations we can name. Look at pottery. Simple pottery, the kind used for storing grain or carrying water. When researchers analyze the decorative patterns on pottery from the Neolithic period, from sites across Europe, Asia, and Africa, they find something extraordinary. The patterns aren't just aesthetic. They're mathematical. The spacing of lines, the repetition of shapes, the proportions of different elements all conform to specific ratios. And those ratios are the same across regions that supposedly had no contact. Someone, somewhere, established a system, a way of organizing space and proportion that felt correct, that felt balanced, that worked. And that system spread, or was remembered, or was maintained across the entire human family. The clay speaks if you know how to listen. Each piece of pottery is a frozen moment of someone's understanding. They didn't need to write down the equations. They felt them. The proportions were in their hands, in their eyes, in their sense of what was harmonious. And that sense was shared across the ancient world. Calendar systems provide another thread. The Mayan calendar, with its sophisticated use of zero as a placeholder and its precise tracking of astronomical cycles, is dated to around the first millennium BCE in its fully developed form. But the mathematical concepts it employs, the base 20 counting system, the understanding of cyclical time, these appear in earlier Mesoamerican cultures. And when you examine the structure of the calendar itself, you find periods and cycles that match, with eerie precision, similar systems in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. The Sumerian sexagesimal system, based on the number 60, gives us 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. This system appears around 3000 BCE in written form. But the choice of 60 as a base isn't arbitrary. 60 is highly divisible. It can be evenly divided by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. It's mathematically elegant for a society that needs to divide land, time, and goods. And yet, that same base 60 system, or variations that suggest knowledge of it, appears in the astronomical observations of pre-Columbian cultures in South America. It appears in the timekeeping systems of ancient India. It appears in the division of the zodiac into 12 houses of 30 degrees each, a system that predates written Sumerian records and appears in cave paintings and stone carvings that are far, far older. The deeper you look, the more the boundaries between ancient cultures begin to blur, not because they were in contact, but because they were drawing from something that existed before the boundaries themselves were drawn. Consider the megalithic yard. In the 1960s, a Scottish engineer named Alexander Thom surveyed hundreds of stone circles and megalithic sites across Britain and Brittany. He discovered that despite being built over centuries by different communities, these structures shared a common unit of measurement. He called it the megalithic yard, approximately 0.829 meters. This unit appears with statistical consistency across sites separated by hundreds of miles and built over a span of more than 1,000 years. The academic response was skepticism. How could Neolithic people, without writing or centralized authority, maintain a standardized measurement across such vast distances and time periods? The answer orthodox archaeology provides is essentially that they didn't, that Tom's findings are coincidental or the result of flawed methodology. But the measurements are there, verified, repeatable. The megalithic yard exists in the stones. So if it wasn't maintained through written records or institutional authority, how was it preserved? How did communities separated by generations and geography continue to build using the same precise measurement? Unless it wasn't preserved, unless it was remembered. There's a concept in anthropology called deep knowledge. The idea that certain types of information can be passed down through purely oral and practical traditions for extraordinary lengths of time. Aboriginal Australian cultures have oral histories that describe coastlines that existed over 10,000 years ago, before sea level rise submerged them, and these descriptions have been verified by geological evidence. The knowledge persisted for 10 millennia without writing. If songs and stories can carry geographical information for 10,000 years, what else might they carry? Could mathematical relationships, ratios, proportions, geometric principles be encoded in practices and traditions so deeply that they become invisible, simply the way things are done, the way things have always been done? The Hindu temple architecture tradition provides a glimpse. The texts that guide temple construction, the Vastu Shastra and Shilpa Shastras, describe elaborate geometric and mathematical rules for the proportions of every element. These texts are old, some dated to the first millennium BCE, but the mathematical principles they describe are far older. They reference concepts and ratios that appear in the Indus Valley civilization 2,000 years before the texts were written. And when archaeologists excavate Indus Valley sites, they find structures that conform to these same proportions. The knowledge moved forward, unbroken, carried in the hands of builders who learned from builders who learned from builders, stretching back into a time before history. Now consider the number 7. 7 appears with startling frequency in ancient systems across the world. 7 days in a week, a division of time that has no obvious astronomical basis. The moon's cycle is approximately 29 days, not divisible by 7. The solar year is 365 days, not divisible by 7. And yet the 7-day week appears in ancient Mesopotamia, in Judaic tradition, in Hindu cosmology, in Chinese systems, in Mesoamerican calendars. 7 visible planets in ancient astronomy: the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. 7 classical metals. 7 tones in the major scale. 7 colors in the rainbow as defined by Newton, who chose that number despite the spectrum being continuous. 7 appears in mythology as a sacred number across unconnected cultures. The 7 sages of ancient India, the 7 wise men of Greece, the 7 generations of indigenous North American prophecy, the 7 heavens in Islamic tradition, the 7 directions in certain Native American cosmologies. Why 7? The standard answer is that it's a manageable number, large enough to be significant but small enough to remember and work with. But that doesn't explain why the same number became sacred and fundamental across cultures that couldn't have influenced each other. Unless the number itself carries meaning that predates the cultures. Unless 7 isn't an invention but a preservation of something older, a mathematical or cosmological principle that ancient humans recognized and encoded into every system they built. The same question applies to 12. 12 months in a year, an approximation of lunar cycles but not an exact match. 12 hours of day and night in the ancient system. 12 signs of the zodiac. 12 tribes of Israel. 12 Olympian gods. 12 animals in the Chinese zodiac. 12 appears in Sumerian mathematics, in Egyptian cosmology, in Mayan calendar systems, in the structure of Hindu temples. 67, 12. These numbers form the skeleton of ancient timekeeping, mythology, and sacred architecture worldwide. They're not arbitrary. They're not coincidental. They're part of a system, a mathematical framework that humanity adopted so early and so universally that we've forgotten it was ever a choice. Think about the night sky. Before light pollution, before cities, the stars were humanity's constant companion. Every culture watched them. Every culture noticed that certain stars moved while others didn't. Every culture saw the same planets, the same constellations, the same cycles. But observing isn't the same as understanding. Understanding requires mathematics. It requires the ability to predict where a planet will be months or years in advance. It requires calculating angles and cycles. It requires sophisticated numerical systems. And every ancient culture that left records had this understanding. The Babylonians could predict lunar eclipses. The Mayans could calculate the Venus cycle to within hours over centuries. The ancient Chinese had star catalogs of extraordinary precision. The Polynesians navigated thousands of miles of open ocean using knowledge of stars, currents, and wave patterns that required complex spatial and mathematical reasoning. This knowledge wasn't written down in the way we write things down. It was lived. It was practiced. It was so fundamental to survival and culture that it didn't need to be explained. It simply was. And much of it was lost. Not all at once, but gradually as populations collapsed, as traditions broke, as new systems replaced old ones. We're left with fragments. Stones arranged in patterns we can measure but not fully explain. Carvings that contain numerical sequences whose purpose we can only guess. Myths that describe cosmic structures using language we interpret as metaphor but which might have been precisely technical. We stand in the ruins of a mathematical language we once spoke fluently. Let's talk about something you carry with you every day without thinking about it. The way you count on your fingers. Most people in Western cultures count starting with the index finger, folding fingers down or holding them up sequentially. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Simple, intuitive, but it's not universal. In many Asian cultures, counting begins with an open hand, and each number is represented by a different configuration, allowing one hand to count to 10 or even higher through different positions and gestures. In some African traditions, counting incorporates not just fingers but the spaces between them, the knuckles, creating a system that can represent larger numbers on a single hand. Among certain indigenous groups in Papua New Guinea, traditional counting systems use a method called body part tallying, where each number corresponds to a specific part of the body touched in sequence. One system documented by anthropologists uses 27 different body parts, allowing counting to 27 using the body as a physical calculator. These aren't primitive methods. They're sophisticated systems, each with its own internal logic, its own mathematical elegance. And they're old. Older than writing. Older than agriculture. They're systems that developed or were maintained when the human body was the only reliable tool for tracking quantity. But here's what's fascinating. When researchers analyze these different counting systems across isolated cultures, they find patterns. Not in the specific method, but in the numerical bases they tend to use. 5, 10, 20. Numbers related to human anatomy. Fingers, toes, the body itself as the original calculator. This makes intuitive sense. We have 10 fingers, so we count in base 10. Logical. Except that's not quite right. Because base 10 isn't as universal as we assume. The Babylonians, as we mentioned, used base 60. The Mayans used base 20. Several cultures used base 5. Binary, base 2, which is fundamental to all modern computing, appears in certain traditional divination systems in Africa. The choice of numerical base isn't determined by anatomy alone. It's determined by what you need to do with numbers. Base 60 is excellent for astronomy and dividing time because of its divisibility. Base 20 works well for cultures that count using both fingers and toes. Base 5 appears in societies where quick, rough estimation is more important than precise large number calculation. Different bases for different purposes. Different mathematical languages for different needs. And here's the unsettling part. When you examine the most ancient artifacts bearing numerical notations, the ones from 30 or 40,000 years ago, you can't always determine what base system they're using. The notches on the Ishango bone could be base 5, base 10, or something else entirely. The patterns are clear, but the underlying system is ambiguous because we don't have enough context. We're looking at a mathematical language we can't fully translate. Imagine reading a book where you recognize the letters but don't know the language. You can see that it's structured. You can identify patterns, repeated words, grammatical constructions, but you can't extract the meaning. That's where we are with the oldest mathematical artifacts. We can see the intelligence, the intentionality, the sophistication, but the full meaning remains obscured. Now shift to geometry, because that's where the mystery deepens further. The pyramids of Giza. We've all seen them. We know they're massive, impressive, ancient, built around 2500 BCE. The Great Pyramid, in particular, has been measured and analyzed more than perhaps any other structure in human history. And the more precisely it's measured, the stranger it becomes. The base of the Great Pyramid is a square, each side approximately 230.4 meters long. The sides are aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of about 1/15 of a degree. The margin of error in the length of the sides is less than 60 millimeters across 230 meters. That's a tolerance of less than 0.03%. The pyramid's height, originally 146.6 meters, and its base create a ratio. If you divide the perimeter of the base by twice the height, you get a number very close to pi 3.14159. This ratio appears to be intentional, encoded into the structure itself. Some researchers argue this is coincidence. Others argue the Egyptians had an approximate knowledge of pi. But there's a third possibility that's rarely discussed, that the builders were working from a mathematical tradition that included precise knowledge of pi, and the pyramid is one expression of that knowledge. The same pyramid also encodes the golden ratio phi in the relationship between its slant height and half its base. Phi appears in the proportions of many living things, in the spiral of shells, the branching of trees, the structure of galaxies. It's a number that emerges from nature itself. And it's there in the stone in Egypt 4,500 years ago. Moved to South America. Machu Picchu, built by the Inca around 1450 CE. The stonework there is famous for its precision. Blocks weighing many tons fitted together so perfectly that you can't slide a knife blade between them. No mortar, just stone on stone, carved and placed with a tolerance that modern masons struggle to achieve. But the precision isn't just in the fit. It's in the geometry. The layout of Machu Picchu aligns with astronomical events. The Intihuatana stone, a carved rock outcrop at the site, casts specific shadows at the solstices. The sight lines from certain structures align with the rising and setting points of important stars and constellations. This requires calculation. It requires knowing the exact latitude of the site, the axial tilt of the Earth, the declination of specific celestial objects. It requires mathematics that we don't usually associate with a culture that, according to conventional history, had no writing system, no wheels, and no iron tools. The Inca had quipu, knotted strings used for record keeping. For a long time, scholars thought quipu were simple accounting tools, ways to track inventory and census data. But recent research suggests they're far more complex. The knots, the colors, the spacing all carry information. Some researchers believe quipu might have encoded not just numbers but narrative information, making them a three-dimensional writing system unlike anything else in human history. And the numerical information they definitely encoded was sophisticated. Quipu contained calculations, decimal systems, possibly even algebraic concepts. They represent a mathematical tradition entirely independent of European or Asian systems, developed in isolation, or so we assume. But was it isolation, or was it independence? Because when you look at the mathematical principles underlying Inca architecture, Egyptian pyramids, Mayan astronomy, Mesopotamian algebra, they're not identical, but they're compatible. They're variations on themes, different dialects of the same mathematical language. There's a branch of mathematics called ethnomathematics, which studies the mathematical practices embedded in different cultures. Challenges the idea that mathematics is a universal, culture-neutral discipline discovered independently by rational inquiry. Instead, it argues that every culture develops its own mathematical thinking based on its needs, environment, and worldview. This framework helps explain the diversity of numerical and geometric systems we find in the archaeological record. Different cultures, different math. Makes sense. But ethnomathematics also reveals something unexpected. Underneath the surface differences, there are deep structural similarities. Across cultures, humans tend to discover or develop the same fundamental concepts. Symmetry, proportion, pattern, recursion. These aren't just mathematical principles. They're cognitive principles, ways the human brain organizes information about the world. Which raises a question. Are these principles discovered, or are they inherent? Is mathematics something we invent to describe reality, or is it something we uncover that's already embedded in reality itself? The ancient philosophers grappled with this. Plato believed that mathematical objects exist in a perfect realm of forms, and what we do is remember them, not create them. Aristotle disagreed, arguing that mathematical concepts are abstractions from physical experience. The debate hasn't been resolved in 2,000 years. But the ancient artifacts suggest something closer to Plato's view. The mathematics doesn't build gradually from simple to complex. It appears seemingly complete, as if the people who used it were accessing something that already existed. Consider the spiral. Spirals appear everywhere in ancient art. On pottery, in carvings, in the layout of certain structures. The spiral is a shape with deep mathematical properties. The most famous spiral, the logarithmic or equiangular spiral, maintains its shape as it grows, each turn a precise ratio larger than the last. This ratio, again, is related to phi, the golden ratio. Logarithmic spirals appear in nature, in nautilus shells, in the arms of galaxies, in the pattern of seeds in a sunflower. They're a fundamental pattern of growth and structure, and they appear in human art dating back tens of thousands of years. The triple spiral carved into the entrance stone at Newgrange, 5,000 years old. Spiral petroglyphs in the American Southwest, some dated to over 1,000 years ago. Spiral designs in Aboriginal Australian rock art, potentially tens of thousands of years old. Were the ancient artists deliberately encoding mathematical relationships, or were they simply drawn to a shape that felt right, a shape that resonated with something deep in their perception? Perhaps it's not an either-or question. Perhaps the mathematics and the aesthetics are the same thing. Perhaps beauty is the human experience of underlying mathematical harmony, and what we call art is the expression of principles we understand intuitively, even if we can't articulate them formally. This idea isn't new. The Pythagoreans believed that numbers were the fundamental reality underlying all things. Music, they discovered, is mathematical. The harmonious intervals, the ones that sound pleasing to the human ear, correspond to simple numerical ratios. An octave is a 2-to-1 frequency ratio. Perfect fifth is 3-to-2. Perfect fourth is 4-to-3. These ratios are universal. Every culture that develops music independently discovers them because they're not cultural constructs. They're physical properties of sound waves and human auditory perception. And these same ratios appear in architecture. The proportions of Greek temples, the intervals between columns, the relationships between different dimensions of sacred spaces. The buildings were composed like music, using the same mathematical principles. Did the Greeks invent this, or did they inherit it from earlier cultures who also understood that mathematics, music, and architecture were different expressions of the same underlying order? The evidence suggests inheritance, because the same principles appear in older structures, the megalithic sites of Western Europe, the temples of ancient Malta, dated to between 3,600 and 3,200 BCE, which show sophisticated use of proportion and alignment. The step pyramids of Mesopotamia, the ziggurats, with their tiered structures based on numerical sequences. Everywhere you look, if you look with mathematical eyes, you see the same language being spoken in different accents. Now think about weaving. Simple weaving, the kind done on a basic loom. The warp and weft, the over-under pattern that creates fabric. This is binary logic. This is computation. Each thread is either over or under, 1 or 0, true or false. Complex patterns in weaving are algorithms, sets of instructions that produce predictable results. And weaving is ancient. Evidence of woven textiles dates back at least 27,000 years. The technology is older than pottery, older than agriculture. For most of human history, weaving was likely done without written instructions. The patterns were learned by watching, by doing, by internalizing the algorithm until it became automatic. But the algorithms were complex. Some traditional weaving patterns from the Andes, from Asia, from Africa, involve sequences that can take days to complete, with hundreds or thousands of individual decisions about which thread goes over or under. These patterns encode information. Some researchers have suggested that certain weaving patterns might have served as mnemonic devices, ways of storing and transmitting knowledge in the structure of the fabric itself. Mathematics hidden in cloth. Information encoded in pattern. Knowledge carried forward by hands that never needed to articulate the rules because the rules were in the doing. This is how mathematical knowledge could persist across vast spans of time without writing. Not in texts, but in practices. Not in theorems, but in traditions. The mathematics was lived, performed, woven into the fabric of daily life so thoroughly that it became invisible. And when those practices were disrupted, when cultures collapsed or were conquered or simply changed, the knowledge didn't just fade. It shattered. Pieces remained, preserved in isolated traditions, in fragments of practice, in shapes and patterns that people continued to use because they worked, even if no one remembered why. We're surrounded by these fragments. The way we divide circles into 360 degrees. The 7-day week. The 12-month year. The proportions we find aesthetically pleasing in art and architecture. These aren't arbitrary. They're inherited. Echoes of a mathematical system that once made perfect sense to someone, somewhere, sometime in the deep past. And we're beginning to recover it. Not by discovering something new, but by recognizing what was always there, hidden in plain sight. Modern mathematics, in its abstractions and formalisms, has circled back to some very ancient ideas. Fractals, patterns that repeat at every scale, are a 20th century mathematical discovery, but fractal patterns appear in ancient art worldwide. The concept of infinity, rigorously formalized by George Cantor in the late 19th century, but discussed by Indian mathematicians over 1,000 years earlier, and alluded to in creation myths from multiple ancient cultures. The mathematics isn't progressing in a straight line. It's spiraling, returning to the same fundamental patterns at deeper levels of understanding. Let's turn to something more recent, more tangible, more immediately verifiable. The mathematics found in ancient board games. The royal game of UR, discovered in a tomb in Iraq, dates to approximately 2500 BCE. It's a race game similar in concept to backgammon. Players move pieces along a track based on the roll of dice, trying to get all their pieces to the end first. Simple, right? Except the game board itself is a work of mathematical art. The layout, the number of squares, the pattern of rosettes that mark special spaces, all of these follow geometric principles. But more than that, when game theorists and mathematicians analyze the probability structures of the game, they find that it's balanced. The rules create a game where chance and strategy interact in sophisticated ways. It's not just random and it's not deterministic. It occupies a mathematical sweet spot that keeps players engaged. Did the ancient Sumerian designers understand probability theory? Did they calculate expected values and variance? Almost certainly not in those terms. But they understood games. They understood what made a game feel fair and exciting. And that understanding is mathematical even if it wasn't formalized. The same applies to Senet, an ancient Egyptian game dating back to at least 3000 BCE. The board is a grid of 30 squares, arranged in 3 rows of 10. Players race their pieces from one end to the other, but certain squares have special meanings, related to Egyptian mythology and the journey of the soul through the afterlife. But strip away the mythology and you have a mathematical object. A state space, a graph where each position on the board is a node, and each possible move is an edge. The structure of Senet is the structure of a mathematical game tree, the kind computer scientists use to analyze games today. Ancient people didn't have computers. They didn't have formal game theory. But they had intuition, refined over generations of play, that led them to create games with deep mathematical structure. And these games spread. The royal game of UR appears in variations across the ancient Middle East and into India. Senet influenced other Egyptian games and possibly games in neighboring cultures. Game mechanics like mathematical ideas traveled along trade routes, evolved, hybridized. Games are social technologies. They're ways of teaching strategic thinking, probability estimation, pattern recognition. They're ways of making mathematics fun, engaging, memorable. And they've been doing that for at least 5,000 years, probably far longer. Which brings us to knots. Knotting, the deliberate tying of rope or cord into patterns, is universal. Every culture that has access to flexible materials creates knots. And knots are topology, a branch of mathematics that studies properties preserved under continuous deformation. A knot is a mathematical object, an embedding of a circle in three-dimensional space. Celtic knotwork, those intricate interlacing patterns found in medieval manuscripts and stone carvings, are topologically sophisticated. Some of the patterns are mathematically equivalent to specific knot types classified by modern topology. The monks who drew them weren't thinking about Riedmeister moves or knot invariants, but they were exploring the same mathematical space. Similar knotwork appears in Islamic geometric art, in Chinese decorative patterns, in Native American beadwork, in African textiles. Each tradition developed its own aesthetic, but the underlying mathematics, the ways lines can weave over and under each other to create closed loops, are the same. And knotwork, like weaving, is ancient. The earliest known evidence of intentional knotting of fibers dates back at least 30,000 years. For most of human history, knots were essential technology. They held tools together, secured clothing, built shelters, made nets for fishing. But they were also art. And art, when you look closely, is often mathematics in disguise. The catterfoil, a shape made of 4 overlapping circles, appears in Gothic architecture across Europe as a symbol of the cross, of the 4 evangelists, of harmony and balance. But it's also a specific geometric construction, one that creates pleasing proportions and symmetries. The same shape appears in Islamic rosette patterns, in Indian mandalas, in Chinese decorative motifs. For circles, overlapping, creating a new shape from their intersection. This is set theory. This is Venn diagrams. This is the mathematics of relationships between groups. The ancient artisans didn't have set theory, but they had compasses and straight edges, or their equivalents, and they explored the shapes that could be created by combining circles and lines. They discovered, through practice and experimentation, the same relationships that modern mathematics describes with symbols and proofs. You see it everywhere once you start looking. The hexagonal tiling in Islamic mosaics is the solution to a packing problem. How do you cover a surface with shapes that fit together perfectly with no gaps? Hexagons are one of only 3 regular polygons that can tile a plane, along with squares and triangles. Islamic artists explored all 3 and combinations of them, creating patterns of stunning complexity. These patterns weren't just decoration. They were meditation. They were ways of contemplating the infinite, the eternal, the divine. And they were mathematical. Each pattern is an algorithm, a set of rules that, when followed, generate the design. Change the rules slightly and you get a different pattern, but one related to the original, part of the same family. This is generative mathematics. This is what we do with computers today. Define a set of rules and let them play out to see what emerges. The medieval Islamic artists were doing the same thing, by hand, with extraordinary patience and skill. And they understood something profound. That mathematics isn't cold or sterile. It's beautiful. It's the structure of beauty itself. The reason certain patterns and proportions feel harmonious is because they reflect deep mathematical relationships that resonate with the structure of our perception, which is itself shaped by the mathematical structure of the universe we inhabit. We're not separate from the mathematics. We're part of it. Our brains are pattern recognition machines, evolved to detect structure, to find order in chaos, to extract the signal from the noise. And the patterns we find most compelling, the ones we call beautiful, are often the ones with the deepest mathematical structure. This isn't mysticism. This is neuroscience meeting mathematics. Studies have shown that when people view images with mathematical symmetry or proportion, certain areas of the brain associated with reward and pleasure activate. We are, quite literally, wired to appreciate mathematics, even if we don't consciously recognize it as such. The ancient artists and architects knew this, not from brain scans but from experience. They knew that certain proportions felt right, that certain ratios created spaces that felt sacred or harmonious, that certain patterns drew the eye and held the attention. And they used this knowledge to create works that have endured for millennia, works that still move us today because they speak to something fundamental in how we perceive and process the world. There's a stone structure in Scotland, in the Orkney Islands, called the Ring of Brodger. It's a circle of standing stones, originally 60 stones. Now only 27 remain standing. It was built around 2500 BCE, contemporary with the Egyptian pyramids and Stonehenge. The diameter of the ring is 125 meters. The stones are evenly spaced around the circumference. This isn't unique. Stone circles are common in Neolithic Britain. But the Ring of Brodger is part of something larger. It sits within a landscape of ceremonial structures, burial mounds, standing stones, other circles, all arranged in relationship to each other, creating a ritual landscape that spans miles. And when archaeologists map this landscape, patterns emerge. Sight lines between structures, alignments to solar and lunar events, geometric relationships in the spacing and positioning of monuments. This isn't random placement. This is landscape geometry, mathematics at the scale of miles, implemented in stone and earth. Why? What was the purpose of such enormous effort? The standard answer is ritual, ceremony, religion, and that's probably part of it. But ritual and mathematics aren't separate. In many ancient cultures, they were the same thing. Ritual was the performance of cosmic order. Ceremony was the enactment of mathematical and astronomical principles, a way of connecting the human community to the larger patterns of nature and the heavens. The stone circles weren't just calendars or temples. They were cosmological models, physical representations of how the ancients understood the structure of reality. And that understanding was mathematical. Consider the structure of the cosmos as ancient peoples saw it. Earth at the center, or Earth as a flat plane. Sky above, underworld below. Sun, moon, stars moving in predictable cycles. The cycles were what mattered. The repetition, the return, the eternal wheel of time. And cycles are mathematics. Period, frequency, phase. The moon waxes and wanes in a cycle of approximately 29.5 days. The sun rises and sets, marking the daily cycle. The seasons turn, the yearly cycle. Longer cycles too. The precession of the equinoxes, a wobble in Earth's axis that takes about 26,000 years to complete. Did ancient people know about precession? Some researchers argue yes. The phenomenon is subtle, requiring observations over many generations to detect. But it's there. The North Star changes over millennia. The position where the sun rises on the equinox shifts slowly against the background of stars, moving through the signs of the zodiac at a rate of about 1 degree every 72 years. If you tracked this for centuries, passed the observations down through generations, you'd eventually notice the pattern. And some ancient texts seem to reference it. The Hindu concept of yugas, vast ages of the world, with durations that some interpret as references to precessional cycles. The Egyptian knowledge of the Great Year, a cycle longer than a human lifetime or even a civilization's lifetime. Whether they understood the mechanism, the physical cause, is another question. But they saw the pattern, the cycle, and they incorporated it into their cosmology, which was their mathematics made sacred. Myth and mathematics intertwine here. The stories ancient peoples told about the gods, about creation, about the structure of the cosmos, these weren't primitive attempts at science that we've now outgrown. They were frameworks for organizing knowledge, for encoding observations, for transmitting information across generations. The Norse myth of Yggdrasil, the world tree, isn't just a story. It's a cosmological diagram. The tree connects 9 worlds, arranged in vertical space. Roots, trunk, branches, up and down, center and periphery. This is topology. This is a graph structure. The myth provides a mental map, a way of organizing spiritual and cosmological concepts, but also a mathematical way of thinking about relationships and connections. The Hindu concept of Mount Meru, the axis mundi at the center of the universe, with the world arranged in concentric circles around it. This is radial symmetry. This is polar coordinates. The myth encodes a geometric worldview. We tend to separate myth from science, story from fact, but that separation is modern. For most of human history, they were integrated. The stories were how you remembered the mathematics. The rituals were how you performed the astronomy. The sacred was the ordered, the patterned, the predictable, as opposed to the chaotic and the random. And this brings us back to those notched bones, those tally marks from 40,000 years ago. What were they tallying? Maybe lunar cycles, as we've speculated. But why track lunar cycles with such care? What need does a nomadic hunter-gatherer have for a precise lunar calendar? Unless the tracking itself was the point. Unless the act of observing, of counting, of noting the pattern was how they connected to something larger. The moon changes, but it changes predictably. You can know, if you count, when it will be full again. You can anticipate. You can plan. You can feel that you understand a small piece of the vast, mysterious cosmos. This is the beginning of science. Not the formal method, not the peer-reviewed papers, but the underlying drive, the desire to find pattern, to make prediction, to transform the unknown into the known. And it's also the beginning of art. Because once you see the pattern, you want to express it, to celebrate it, to make it tangible. You carve it into bone. You paint it on stone. You arrange megaliths to mark the moments when the pattern manifests most clearly, the solstices, the equinoxes, the extreme points of the lunar cycle. Science and art, in their origin, were one. Both were ways of engaging with the mathematical structure of reality. Both were ways of making meaning from pattern. Centuries later, millennia later, we've specialized. We have professional mathematicians who work in abstraction, artists who work in aesthetics, scientists who work in experimentation. The integration has been lost, replaced by disciplines with sharp boundaries. But the ancient world didn't have those boundaries. A person who built a stone circle was astronomer, mathematician, engineer, priest, artist, all at once. The knowledge wasn't compartmentalized. It was holistic, integrated, woven into the fabric of life and worldview. And perhaps that's what we've lost, more than specific mathematical knowledge. We've lost the integration. We've lost the sense that mathematics is sacred, that geometry is a path to understanding the divine, that number and form are not abstract concepts but fundamental realities. The Pythagoreans understood this. All is number, they said, not metaphorically but literally. Numbers weren't just tools for counting. They were the substance of reality itself. Modern physics, in a strange way, has circled back to this idea. Quantum mechanics describes reality in terms of mathematical objects, wave functions, probability amplitudes, operators in Hilbert spaces. The universe, at its most fundamental level, seems to be made of mathematics. Particles aren't little balls. They're excitations in quantum fields, and fields are mathematical structures. Space-time isn't a container. It's a geometric object defined by equations. The ancient intuition that mathematics is the deep truth of things has turned out to be, in a sense, correct. We just took a few thousand years of detour through materialism to get back to it. And the ancient mathematical knowledge we find in bones and stones and alignments, it's evidence that this intuition is old. Older than writing, older than cities, deep in the human experience, woven into our earliest attempts to make sense of the world. There's an archaeological site in Germany called the Gonnersdorf settlement, dated to approximately 13,000 years ago. Among the artifacts recovered are hundreds of engraved stones, pieces of slate carved with images of animals, primarily horses and mammoths. The engravings are beautiful, skillful, showing the animals in profile with remarkable anatomical accuracy. But some of the stones contain something else. Abstract patterns, grids, crosses, parallel lines with cross-hatching, geometric designs with no obvious representational content. These aren't idle doodles. The lines are precise, carefully executed, often forming symmetrical patterns. What are they? Decoration? Symbols? Records? We don't know. We can't know. The people who made them left no explanation, no key to interpretation. but we can recognize them as mathematical. They show understanding of symmetry, of repetition, of pattern. They demonstrate the ability to plan a design, to execute it carefully, to create something that exists not for practical utility but for its own sake, for the satisfaction of creating order from chaos. This is 13,000 years ago, 5,000 years before the first cities, 8,000 years before writing. And yet here is abstract, non-representational art that is fundamentally geometric, fundamentally mathematical. The patterns aren't unique to Gonnersdorf. Similar geometric engravings appear at other Paleolithic sites across Europe, Africa, and Asia. The Blombos Cave in South Africa has pieces of ochre, dated to 75,000 years ago, engraved with crosshatch patterns. The regularity, the symmetry, the precision all suggest intentionality, purpose, meaning. What meaning? We project our interpretations, art, symbolism, proto-writing, tallies, but we're guessing. The true meaning is lost. What remains is the pattern, the evidence of a mind capable of abstract thought, of creating and recognizing structure. And structure is mathematics. Fast forward to 3,000 years ago, the Late Bronze Age. Complex societies across the Mediterranean, the Near East into Asia. Writing systems well established. Trade networks spanning thousands of miles. And then, around 1200 BCE, everything collapses. The Bronze Age collapse. Civilizations fall. Cities are abandoned. Writing disappears in some regions for centuries. Trade networks disintegrate. The causes are debated. Climate change, drought, invasions, systems collapse. Probably all of the above, reinforcing each other in a catastrophic cascade. And with the civilizations, knowledge was lost. Technologies forgotten. The Hittites knew how to smelt iron, a closely guarded secret. When their civilization fell, the knowledge spread, ironically because the smiths dispersed but other knowledge didn't spread. Simply vanished. How much mathematics was lost in the Bronze Age collapse? How many astronomical observations, geometric principles, calculation methods existed in palace archives that burned or were abandoned? We'll never know. We only know that when writing reappears in Greece a few centuries later, it's different. The syllabic linear B script of the Mycenaeans used for administrative records is gone. The alphabetic Greek script, borrowed from the Phoenicians, takes its place. And there's a gap, a dark age, a period where the archaeological record thins, where the continuity of culture is broken. But some knowledge survived. Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were composed during or just after this dark age, transmitted orally for generations before being written down. They contain knowledge, not mathematical primarily, but cosmological, geographical, astronomical. The description of Odysseus navigating by the stars. The references to constellations, to celestial navigation. If poetry could carry that knowledge through a dark age, what else might have been preserved in oral tradition? Mathematical principles? Geometric methods? Astronomical observations? The Pythagoreans, emerging a few centuries later, claimed to possess ancient wisdom, knowledge passed down from earlier sages. Were they inventing a mythology of ancient authority to legitimize their teachings, or were they actually preserving something real, something that had been transmitted through the dark ages in secretive traditions? We can't prove it either way, but the pattern repeats throughout history. Knowledge lost, knowledge preserved in fragments, knowledge rediscovered or reconstructed. The fall of Rome, the Library of Alexandria burning, the collapse of classical learning in Western Europe, preserved in monasteries and in the Islamic world, then slowly reintroduced during the Renaissance. Each collapse is a severance. Each recovery is incomplete. We're always looking at shadows of what was known before, trying to reconstruct the original from fragments. And if this pattern applies to the last 3,000 years, the period we call history, how much more does it apply to the longer, darker stretches of prehistory? How many times has mathematical knowledge been developed, transmitted, lost, rediscovered over the tens of thousands of years of human cognitive modernity? The archaeological record is sparse. Most of what existed has decayed, been destroyed, been lost to time. We find the durable things, Stone, bone, ceramic, metal. Everything else, everything organic, everything not deliberately preserved, is gone. Wood rots, fabric decays, leather crumbles, paper burns. How much was written on materials that didn't survive? How many mathematical texts existed on papyrus, on bark, on woven textiles that will never recover? The Inca quipu we discussed earlier are rare survivals. Most didn't make it. Most cultures in most places at most times left no written record at all. Not because they didn't have knowledge, but because the media they used didn't last. We're seeing the tip of the iceberg. The tiny fraction that happened to be made of materials that endure. And from that tiny fraction, we're trying to reconstruct the intellectual world of the past. It's like trying to understand modern mathematics by examining only the equations carved into building facades. You'd see some formulas, some symbols, but you'd miss the textbooks, the journals, the computer programs, the living practice of mathematics as it's actually done. The ancient world had its equivalent of textbooks and journals, teaching and learning, practice and tradition. Almost all of it is gone. What we have are the monuments, the graves, the garbage heaps, the intentional records and the accidental survivals. From this, we make inferences. We build theories. We construct narratives. And the narrative we've constructed is one of progress, of gradual accumulation. Humanity starts simple and gets more complex, more knowledgeable, more sophisticated over time. It's a comforting narrative. It suggests we're at the pinnacle or at least moving toward it. But what if the narrative is wrong? What if the pattern is not linear but cyclical? What if knowledge rises and falls, blooms and withers, emerges and vanishes across the vast canvas of human time? The evidence doesn't contradict this. The sudden appearance of sophisticated mathematical knowledge in the archaeological record, the lack of obvious precursors, the strange consistency across separated cultures, all of this fits better with a model of preserved and transmitted knowledge than with a model of independent, gradual invention. Let's consider a specific example that brings all of this into sharp focus: the Antikythera mechanism. In 1901, sponge divers working off the coast of the Greek island of Antikythera discovered a shipwreck. Among the artifacts recovered was a corroded lump of bronze and wood, barely recognizable. It sat in a museum for decades, largely ignored, until someone noticed that it contained gears. Gears. Precision-cut bronze gears, in an artifact dated to approximately 100 BCE. As researchers cleaned and X-rayed the mechanism, the complexity became clear. It's not just a few gears. It's a sophisticated mechanical computer designed to calculate the positions of the sun, moon, and planets. It can predict eclipses. It has a gear train with complex ratios that model the irregular orbit of the moon. It even accounts for the elliptical, non-circular nature of lunar motion, incorporating an epicyclic gear system that mirrors the mathematical models of Hipparchus. This shouldn't exist. According to the standard history of technology, gears like this don't appear until medieval clockwork over 1,000 years later. The precision, the engineering, the astronomical knowledge encoded in the device, all of it represents a level of sophistication we didn't think the ancient Greeks possessed. But they did. The mechanism is real. It exists. You can see it in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. And here's the unsettling question. If they could build this, what else could they build? What other technologies, what other knowledge did they have that we've lost track of because the artifacts didn't survive or haven't been found yet, or were melted down for scrap metal centuries ago? The Antikythera mechanism isn't unique because it's the only sophisticated device the Greeks made. It's unique because it's the only one that happened to sink in a shipwreck in a location where it could be preserved in anaerobic conditions and then recovered by chance 2,000 years later. How many others existed? How many were lost? And if the Greeks had this in 100 BCE, who taught them? Where did the knowledge come from? There's no evidence of a tradition of building such devices. The mechanism appears, fully formed, with no obvious precursors. Then it disappears. The knowledge is lost in the chaos of the following centuries, and mechanical computing doesn't reappear until medieval Europe reinvents it, probably independently. Lost and rediscovered. The pattern repeats. Or consider mathematics itself. Euclidean geometry, the system taught in schools for 2 millennia, is codified in Euclid's Elements around 300 BCE. It's a masterpiece of logical reasoning, starting from a few axioms and deriving hundreds of theorems. But Euclid didn't discover this geometry. He compiled it. He systematized knowledge that already existed, that had been developed by earlier mathematicians whose names we sometimes know, Pythagoras, Thales, Eudoxus, and whose names we often don't, the unnamed teachers and thinkers who worked out these principles over generations. And where did they get it? Some of it is credited to Egyptian and Babylonian sources. The Greeks learned geometry from the Egyptians, who used it for surveying and architecture. They learned algebra from the Babylonians, who had sophisticated methods for solving equations. But the Egyptians and Babylonians themselves didn't emerge fully formed. They had predecessors. Their knowledge came from somewhere, was built on something. Trace it back far enough and you reach the same mystery. The knowledge appears already sophisticated with no clear origin. Unless the origin is older than we've been willing to consider. Unless the knowledge has been circulating in one form or another for far longer than the 5,000 years of recorded history. The Babylonians had algorithms for calculating square roots, accurate to several decimal places, in 2000 BCE. They had tables of reciprocals of squares and cubes, tools for complex calculations. They understood quadratic equations. Where did they learn this? They didn't wake up one day and invent algebra. They inherited it, modified it, passed it on. But inherited from whom? The standard answer is earlier Mesopotamian cultures. The Sumerians. And yes, the Sumerians had mathematics, sophisticated mathematics, recorded on clay tablets from 3000 BCE and earlier. But the Sumerians themselves spoke of earlier times, of knowledge granted by gods, by the Anunnaki, by beings from before the flood. We read this as mythology. But what if it's cultural memory? Not of gods, but of predecessors of an earlier high culture whose knowledge was absorbed and transmitted? The Sumerian king list includes reigns of impossible length before the flood. Kings who ruled for 30,000 years. Obviously mythological. But after the flood, the reign lengths become plausible, eventually matching historical records. The structure suggests a framework where mythological deep time transitions into historical time, with the flood as the boundary. The flood myths themselves are global, appearing in cultures with no contact. A memory of something. Climate change at the end of the Ice Age. Sea level rise that submerged coastlines where, given that humans prefer to live near water, there were likely significant populations. If those coastal populations had developed knowledge, cultures, systems of mathematics and astronomy, and then were displaced or destroyed by rising seas, their knowledge would have survived only in fragments, carried inland by refugees, absorbed into inland cultures, transmitted as the wisdom of the ancestors who came from the drowned lands. This is speculation, but it's speculation that fits the evidence better than the assumption that every culture invented everything independently. Look at metallurgy. Copper smelting appears around 7,000 years ago in multiple locations. Then bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, appears around 5,000 years ago. Bronze is superior to copper, harder, more durable. But making bronze requires tin, which is rare. The sources of tin in the ancient world were limited in Afghanistan, in Cornwall in Britain, in a few other locations. Yet bronze appears in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, all within a relatively short time span. How did they all learn to make bronze? How did they all gain access to tin, which had to be traded over vast distances? The standard answer is trade networks and independent invention of similar technologies. Possible. But it requires a lot of independent invention happening in a very short window of time. Or there was diffusion. Knowledge spreading along trade routes, carried by smiths, by merchants, by travelers. A technological tradition that moved faster than we usually assume, that connected cultures more thoroughly than we usually credit. And if metallurgy could spread that way, why not mathematics? Why not astronomical knowledge? Why not geometric principles? Ideas travel faster than artifacts. A traveler can carry a method, an algorithm, a geometric construction in their head and teach it thousands of miles from where they learned it. And if those ideas are useful, they'll be adopted, adapted, integrated into local traditions. Over time, the origin is forgotten. The method becomes indigenous, part of the local knowledge base, its foreign source erased by generations of transmission. This is how knowledge could become global without a single originating civilization. Not through a lost Atlantis that taught everyone, but through networks, through connections, through the slow but steady diffusion of useful ideas across the human family. Think about the night sky again. Imagine you're living 10,000 years ago. No artificial light. When the sun sets, the stars are overwhelming. Thousands of them, the Milky Way, a river of light across the darkness. Every clear night you see them. They become familiar. You notice patterns, the constellations. You notice movement, the planets wandering among the fixed stars. You notice cycles. The moon changes predictably. Certain stars rise before dawn at certain times of year. These observations aren't abstract. They're practical. The appearance of certain stars might signal the rainy season, the time to plant, the time when game animals migrate. The sky is a calendar, a guide, a tool for survival. But observing is one thing. Recording is another. How do you remember the patterns? How do you communicate them? How do you ensure the knowledge passes to the next generation? You tell stories. The constellations become characters. The movements become narratives. The hunter, the bear, the swan. The stories encode the astronomical information in memorable form. This isn't primitive. This is sophisticated information technology, using narrative as a storage and transmission medium. And you make marks. Notches on bone to track the moon. Stones arranged to mark where the sun rises on important days. Carvings that depict the patterns you see in the sky. Over generations, the system becomes elaborate. The stories develop details, layers. The marks become standardized. A tradition forms, a body of knowledge maintained by specialists, shamans or priests or astronomers, different names for the same role. This is how oral cultures maintain complex information. Not through writing, but through practice, through ritual, through art, through story. The information is encoded in multiple forms, redundant, resilient, and the information is mathematical. The cycles are periodic functions. The positions are geometric. The predictions are calculations, even if they're not written as equations. Stonehenge is one expression of this knowledge. Built over many centuries, from about 3000 to 2000 BCE, it's aligned to the solstices. Stand in the center on the summer solstice, and you see the sun rise directly over the heel stone. On the winter solstice, the sun sets between the great trilithons. These alignments are precise. They require knowledge of the solar year, of the latitude of the site, of geometry. They require planning and execution over generations. A continuity of purpose and knowledge that's almost unimaginable in our fragmented modern world. But Stonehenge isn't just a solar calendar. Recent research suggests it also tracks lunar cycles, specifically the 18.6-year cycle of lunar standstills, the extreme points of moonrise and moonset as the moon's orbit oscillates over nearly 2 decades. Tracking this requires observations spanning multiple generations. The people who began building Stonehenge wouldn't live to see the cycle complete even twice. The knowledge had to be maintained, passed down, kept alive through cultural memory and continuity. And they did it. The stones are there. The alignments work. The knowledge was real. Now multiply this. Stonehenge is one site. There are thousands of megalithic sites across Britain and Europe. Thousands more across the rest of the world, in forms that suit local materials and conditions. Stone circles, earthworks, temples, pyramids, each one a crystallization of astronomical and mathematical knowledge, each one a testament to the sophistication of the people who built it. We've spent centuries underestimating them, imagining them as primitive, as less intelligent, less capable than us. But they had the same brains, the same cognitive abilities. They lacked our accumulated technology, but they didn't lack intelligence or curiosity or the capacity for abstract thought. And in some ways, they had advantages we've lost. Their connection to the natural world, their intimate knowledge of the cycles of sun and moon and stars, the rhythms of seasons and tides and animal behavior. We've outsourced that knowledge to clocks and calendars and apps. We don't need to know when the full moon rises because we can look it up. We don't need to navigate by stars because we have GPS. But they needed to know. And so they did. They paid attention. They remembered. They taught their children. And over generations, the knowledge deepened, became precise, became mathematical. The mathematics wasn't written in symbols. It was written in stones, in stories, in rituals, in the muscle memory of practices performed the same way for centuries. And when those traditions broke, when populations moved or collapsed or were conquered, the mathematics didn't necessarily break with them. It could be absorbed, translated, integrated into new systems. The knowledge was portable, resilient, adaptable. This is why we find similar mathematical principles across disconnected cultures. Not because of a single origin point, but because the principles are effective, because they work, because humans everywhere, when they pay attention to the cosmos, notice the same patterns and develop similar methods to track and predict them. But here's the unsettling part. If the knowledge is that resilient, that adaptable, that widespread, how old could it actually be? How far back does the tradition of mathematical astronomy extend? We have archaeological evidence going back 40,000 years. Notched bones tracking lunar cycles. That's the earliest hard evidence. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. The fact that we haven't found older examples doesn't mean they don't exist. It means either they haven't been found, or they didn't survive, or we haven't recognized them for what they are. Human cognitive modernity, the full suite of mental abilities that make us human, appears in the archaeological record at least 70,000 years ago, possibly earlier. Language, symbolic thinking, long-term planning, all of these are present by that time. If humans 70,000 years ago had the cognitive capacity for mathematics, for astronomical observation, for geometric thinking, did they use it? Why wouldn't they? The stars were there. The moon waxed and waned. The seasons turned. The patterns were available to be noticed by anyone who watched. We assume they didn't because we haven't found evidence. But we've barely scratched the surface of the archaeological record. Most sites from that era are underwater, submerged by sea level rise. Most artifacts have decayed. Most knowledge was never recorded in durable form. The absence of evidence might just mean we're not looking in the right places, or we're not looking in the right way, or the evidence is too subtle, too fragmentary, too different from what we expect to find. What if the mathematical tradition we can trace back 5,000 years to the Sumerians and Egyptians is itself just the latest iteration of something much, much older? What if mathematics, in some form, has been part of human culture for tens of thousands of years, developed and lost and rediscovered and transmitted in forms we can barely imagine? The evidence doesn't disprove this. The notched bones, the carved patterns, the geometric consistency across ancient structures, all of it is consistent with a deep, ancient tradition of mathematical thinking. We stand at the end of a very long chain, holding the latest links, trying to peer back into the darkness to see where it begins. And the darkness is vast. 50,000 years, 70,000, 100,000. How far back does human curiosity go? How long have we been looking at the stars and wondering? There's a photograph you might have seen. It's from the Hubble Space Telescope called the Hubble Deep Field. The telescope pointed at a tiny, seemingly empty patch of sky, no bigger than a grain of sand held at arm's length, and took a long exposure. The result showed thousands of galaxies, each containing billions of stars, in that tiny patch of apparent emptiness. The image is humbling. It reveals the scale of the universe, the sheer quantity of existence beyond our little planet. And it prompts a thought. If the universe is so vast, so full of stars and planets, where is everyone else? Why haven't we encountered other intelligent life? This is the Fermi paradox, and there are many proposed solutions. Maybe intelligent life is rare. Maybe civilizations destroy themselves. Maybe interstellar travel is impossible. Maybe they're out there, but we haven't detected them yet. But here's another possibility, one that ties back to our discussion. Maybe intelligence is common, but technological civilization is fragile. Maybe the rise from intelligence to advanced technology isn't inevitable. Maybe it requires a very specific set of circumstances, and maybe those circumstances are easily disrupted. Look at human history. We've been cognitively modern for at least 70,000 years, possibly twice that. But we've only had what we call civilization, cities and writing and complex technology, for about 5,000 years. That's a tiny fraction of our history as a species. For most of human existence, we were intelligent, curious, capable of complex thought, but we didn't build cities or invent writing. We lived in small groups, moved with the seasons, passed knowledge orally. We had culture, art, probably mathematics and astronomy in forms we struggle to recognize now, but we didn't have the trajectory toward the technological world we inhabit today. Something changed around 10,000 years ago. Agriculture, settled life, population density, surplus food, specialization. All of this created conditions where knowledge could accumulate more rapidly, where innovations could build on each other, where writing became necessary to track increasingly complex social and economic systems. But it almost didn't happen. The transition to agriculture was difficult. It required the right climate, the right plants and animals available for domestication, the right social conditions. The window opened after the Ice Age ended, as the climate stabilized and warmed. If that window hadn't opened, if the climate had remained unstable, or if the megafauna extinctions at the end of the Ice Age had been more complete, depriving humans of domesticable animals, we might still be hunter-gatherers, still intelligent, still capable, but without the trajectory towards cities and technology. And even after agriculture began, the path wasn't smooth. Civilizations rose and fell. Knowledge was gained and lost. The Bronze Age collapse, the fall of Rome, the burning of libraries, dark ages where literacy declined, where technologies were forgotten, where the continuity of knowledge was broken. We think of progress as inevitable, but it's not. It's contingent. It depends on conditions, on continuity, on enough stability for knowledge to accumulate and be transmitted. And mathematics, being abstract, being non-material, is especially vulnerable. You can't excavate an equation. You can't carbon date a theorem. If the texts are lost, if the tradition breaks, the mathematics has to be reconstructed from scratch, or from the fragments that remain embedded in practices and structures. So here's the question. How many times has humanity climbed partway up the ladder of mathematical knowledge, only to fall back down? How many times have we developed sophisticated systems, only to lose them when circumstances changed? The archaeological evidence suggests it's happened repeatedly. Knowledge appearing, flourishing, then vanishing. The Antikythera mechanism. The precision of ancient megalithic constructions. The mathematical sophistication of cultures we're taught to think of as primitive. Each time, the recovery isn't complete. Some knowledge is lost permanently. Some is rediscovered. Some persists in altered, degraded forms, the meaning forgotten but the practice continued. We're in a moment of unprecedented knowledge accumulation now. We have writing, printing, digital storage, the internet. Information is redundant, distributed, backed up. It feels permanent. But is it? Digital information is fragile in its own way. It requires infrastructure, electricity, functioning computers. If that infrastructure failed, if civilization underwent another collapse, how much of our digital knowledge would survive? Physical books might outlast hard drives and servers. Stone inscriptions might outlast paper. The ancient peoples who carved their knowledge into stone, who built monuments aligned to celestial events, who encoded mathematics into the proportions of their temples, they were building for permanence. They were ensuring that even if the knowledge itself was lost, the evidence of the knowledge would remain. And it has. We stand among their monuments, trying to decode what they knew, what they understood, what they were trying to preserve. In a sense, we're in a position similar to theirs. We have knowledge. We have mathematical and scientific understanding that would have seemed like magic to people a few centuries ago. But we also know that it's fragile, that it depends on a complex, interconnected system of education and technology and institutions. If that system fractured, what would we save? What could we encode into permanent form so that people thousands of years from now could recover it? The ancient choice was geometry in stone, alignments to celestial cycles, proportions and ratios that would persist even when the explanations were forgotten. These are passive stores of information, waiting for someone with the knowledge to recognize them. We've added active stores, books, databases, digital archives. But we've also created dependencies. Our mathematics exists primarily in forms that require our current technology to access. If the technology fails, much of the mathematics becomes inaccessible, locked in formats that can't be read without machines we no longer have. The ancients, perhaps having experienced loss themselves, chose differently. They put their knowledge where it couldn't easily be destroyed, in stone and earth and sky, in forms that would endure. And now we find it and we marvel and we struggle to understand because we're separated not just by time but by a break in continuity, a gap where the transmission of knowledge failed, where the tradition was lost or suppressed or simply forgotten. But the knowledge isn't gone. It's encoded, waiting, in the ratios of temples, in the spacing of megaliths, in the patterns carved into bone and stone, in the stories passed down, myths that might contain memories of real events, real knowledge, real people who understood things we're only beginning to rediscover. This is the true mystery. Not that ancient people were primitive, but that they were sophisticated, and that their sophistication has been hidden from us by time, by loss, by our own assumptions about the linearity of progress. Let me tell you about the Ishango bone one more time, but differently. It's 25,000 years old. It sits in a museum in Belgium now, a small piece of a baboon's fibula, dark brown, carved with 3 columns of notches. Archaeologists have stared at it for decades. Mathematicians have analyzed it. Theories have been proposed and debated. And the simplest interpretation is the most unsettling. Someone, 25,000 years ago, understood prime numbers. Prime numbers are strange. They're numbers divisible only by 1 and themselves. They're the building blocks of all other numbers. Every integer can be broken down into a unique combination of primes. They're fundamental to number theory, to cryptography, to the deep structure of mathematics itself. And they're not intuitive. You don't stumble upon primes by accident. You find them by thinking abstractly about the properties of numbers, by asking not just how many but what kind. The Ishango bone shows 11, 13, 17, 19. The primes between 10 and 20. Listed sequentially, deliberately carved into bone by someone who noticed something about these numbers, something that made them worth recording. Why? What use did a Paleolithic person have for prime numbers? What practical application could they possibly serve? Maybe none. Maybe the carving wasn't practical. Maybe it was intellectual. Maybe someone, 25,000 years ago, sat by a fire and played with numbers the way we play with puzzles, noticing patterns, seeing structure, satisfying a curiosity that had no external purpose but felt important nonetheless. If that's true, it means the impulse toward pure mathematics, mathematics for its own sake, is as old as any other human trait. The desire to understand, to find pattern, to push beyond the practical into the abstract, this is what makes us human. And it's been part of us for at least 25,000 years. But there's another possibility. Maybe the primes did have a purpose, one we don't understand because we don't have the context. Maybe they were part of a counting system, a method, a tradition that made sense to the person who carved them and to their community, but which has been lost so completely that we can't even guess at it now. The bone is evidence of something. We just don't know what. And that uncertainty, that gap in our understanding, is a window into the vastness of what we've forgotten. Every archaeological artifact is a message from the past. Most of them we can read, at least partially. A stone tool tells us about hunting, about technology. A burial tells us about ritual, about social structure. A pot tells us about food storage, about trade. But some messages are in a language we don't speak. The notched bones, the geometric carvings, the arrangements of stones. We see that they're meaningful. We see the intelligence, the intention, but the meaning itself is obscured. And mathematics, because it's abstract, because it doesn't necessarily have physical reference, is especially vulnerable to this kind of loss. A mathematical insight can exist entirely in the mind, be communicated entirely through teaching and demonstration, and then vanish completely when the chain of transmission breaks. Unless it's encoded into something physical, into bone, into stone, into the proportions of buildings and the spacing of monuments. Then it persists, a frozen echo of understanding, waiting for someone to recognize it. We're recognizing it now, slowly, with difficulty. But we're beginning to see that the ancient world was mathematically richer than we've assumed, that the people we've thought of as primitive were often sophisticated, that the knowledge we thought we invented was sometimes remembered. This doesn't diminish our accomplishments. It contextualizes them. It suggests that we're part of a longer story, that the mathematics we do today is the latest chapter in a book that began tens of thousands of years ago, was written in fragments by countless unnamed people, was lost and found and lost again, and which we're still in the process of reading. Look at yourself in the mirror. The face looking back is the same biologically, neurologically, cognitively, as the faces of the people who carved the Ashango bone, who built Göbekli Tepe, who aligned Stonehenge to the solstice sun. The same brain, the same capacity, the same potential. They weren't less than us. They were us, separated by time and circumstance, possessing knowledge we've lost, lacking knowledge we've gained, but fundamentally the same in the ways that matter. And if they could develop sophisticated mathematics without writing, without institutions, without the accumulated infrastructure of knowledge that we take for granted, what does that say about the nature of mathematics itself? Maybe it's not something we create. Maybe it's something we discover, something that exists independently of us, woven into the structure of reality, waiting to be found by any mind capable of looking for it. The Platonists believed this. They believed mathematical objects are real, not in the physical sense but in a deeper, more fundamental sense. A circle is a perfect idea, and physical circles are merely imperfect approximations of that ideal form. This seems mystical, impractical. But modern mathematics has drifted back toward something like this view. Mathematicians speak of discovering theorems, not inventing them. They describe the sense of exploring a landscape that already exists, of finding truths that were always there, waiting. And if mathematics is discovered rather than invented, then it makes sense that different cultures, separated by time and space, could discover the same truths. The Pythagorean theorem is true regardless of who proves it. Pi is the same in ancient Egypt and modern America. The golden ratio appears in nature and in art across millennia because it's a property of geometry itself, not a human construction. The ancient mathematicians were explorers of this landscape. They mapped different territories, used different methods, expressed their findings in different forms. But they were exploring the same territory, the same fundamental mathematical reality. And we've inherited their maps, fragmentary and damaged as they are. We're still using their discoveries. The base 60 system in our clocks. The geometric principles in our architecture. The astronomical cycles in our calendars. These are continuities stretching back thousands of years. Threads connecting us to people whose names we'll never know, but whose insights we use every day. This is the legacy. Not monuments, though those are impressive. Not artifacts, though those are valuable. The real legacy is the knowledge itself, the mathematical understanding that has been maintained, transmitted, modified, lost and recovered, but never completely extinguished, carried forward by the long chain of human minds stretching back into the deep past. And it continues. We add our own insights, our own methods. We extend the maps, explore new territories. We're part of the tradition, the long conversation about number and form and pattern that began when the first human noticed that the moon waxes and wanes in a cycle, that the seasons turn predictably, that stones can be arranged to mark time and space. Let's bring this to a close with a question, not an answer. Because the nature of this inquiry, the nature of the evidence, doesn't allow for neat conclusions. It allows only for deeper questions. What if the mathematics we use today, the systems we've developed, the knowledge we've accumulated, what if it's not new? What if it's remembrance? Not in a mystical sense, not reincarnation or genetic memory, but in a cultural sense. What if the knowledge has been circulating in various forms for so long that we've forgotten its origin? What if we're not inventing mathematics but recovering it, rediscovering principles that were once known, were lost, and are now being found again? The evidence, as we've explored, is suggestive. The notched bones from 40,000 years ago, the geometric sophistication of structures built 10,000 years ago, the mathematical consistency across ancient cultures, the sudden appearance of complex knowledge systems without obvious precursors, the technologies like the Antikythera mechanism that seem impossibly advanced for their time. None of this proves a lost advanced civilization in the Atlantis sense. There's no evidence for a single, globe-spanning, technologically advanced society that taught everyone else. That's a fantasy, a narrative we've imposed on the past because it's dramatic and satisfying. But there is evidence for something subtler, more interesting, more resilient. A mathematical tradition, a way of thinking about number and pattern and cycle, that emerged early in human history, that was maintained and transmitted through oral and practical means, that spread through contact and trade, that was encoded into monuments and rituals and stories, and that has persisted in fragmentary and modified forms down to the present day. This tradition isn't a single thing. It's a family of related ideas, variations on fundamental themes. Different cultures expressed it differently, adapted it to their needs, integrated it with their worldviews. But underneath the diversity, there's unity. The same geometric ratios, the same astronomical cycles, the same mathematical principles. And when we do mathematics today, when we calculate the area of a circle using pi, when we appreciate the golden ratio in art, when we structure our time into weeks and months based on ancient choices, we're participating in that tradition. We're speaking a language whose grammar was worked out tens of thousands of years ago by people we'll never know, whose genius we've systematically underestimated. The question, then, isn't whether ancient people had mathematical knowledge. Clearly they did. The question is how much, how sophisticated, how widespread. And the answer is almost certainly more than we think. Because our assumptions about the past have been shaped by bias, by the accident of what survives, by the limits of our imagination. We've assumed that complexity requires writing, that sophistication requires cities, that abstract thinking is a recent development. We've been wrong on all counts. Complexity can exist in oral cultures. Sophistication can exist without cities. Abstract thinking is as old as modern humans, perhaps older. The archaeological record keeps surprising us. Every decade brings new discoveries that push back the timeline of human capability. Older art, earlier structures, more sophisticated artifacts. The story keeps getting longer, deeper, more complex. And there's no reason to think we've reached the bottom. Most of the world's archaeological sites haven't been excavated. Most of the coastlines where ancient people likely lived are now underwater. Most organic materials have decayed. We're working with an incomplete, biased sample. What will we find in the next century of archaeology? What new evidence will emerge to challenge our current understanding? We can't know. But based on the pattern of past discoveries, we can predict that it will be surprising, that it will push human capability further back in time, that it will reveal our ancestors to have been more sophisticated than we currently believe. And as that happens, the narrative will shift. The story of human mathematical knowledge will become longer, more complex, less linear. We'll move away from the idea of a sudden invention of mathematics in the Bronze Age and toward the idea of a long, gradual, punctuated development stretching back into the Paleolithic with multiple threads, multiple traditions, multiple innovations and transmissions and recoveries. This is a more interesting story. It's also a more humble one. It requires us to give up the comforting notion that we're at the pinnacle, that everyone before us was stumbling in darkness until we arrived with our enlightenment. Instead, we're part of a long line. We stand on the shoulders of giants, but those giants stand on the shoulders of others, and the chain extends back further than we can easily see, into the mists of prehistory, to people whose names are lost but whose contributions endure. The mathematics we do is their mathematics, modified and extended, but fundamentally continuous with what they began. When we teach a child to count, we're transmitting knowledge that is, in some form, tens of thousands of years old. When we explain geometry, we're working in a tradition that built Stonehenge and the pyramids. When we calculate astronomical cycles, we're using methods refined over hundreds of generations by people who watched the sky with an attention we can barely imagine. This should give us a sense of scale, a sense of deep time, a sense of our place in a story much larger than ourselves. And it should give us humility, because if knowledge this old can be lost, fragmented, forgotten, despite being so fundamental, so useful, so hard-won, then nothing is safe. The knowledge we have now, the mathematics and science and technology we've accumulated, it's not guaranteed to persist. It requires active maintenance, active transmission, active teaching. It requires institutions and practices and culture. If those fail, if our civilization undergoes a collapse on the scale of the Bronze Age collapse or worse, what will remain? What will future archaeologists, if there are any, find when they excavate our ruins? Will they look at our buildings and wonder how we calculated the proportions? Will they find our artifacts and puzzle over the mathematical knowledge encoded in them? Will they underestimate us the way we've underestimated our ancestors? Or will we have built something more resilient, something that can survive the kind of disruption that has erased so much of the past? These are uncomfortable questions. They're also important ones. Because recognizing the fragility of knowledge, recognizing that what we know is the result of a long, difficult, punctuated process of discovery and transmission and recovery, that recognition should motivate us to preserve, to teach, to pass it on as carefully as we can. The ancients tried. They carved it in stone. They built it in monuments. They wove it into stories. Some of it survived. Much didn't. We can do better. We have more tools, more redundancy, more ways to store and transmit information. But we also have more fragility, more complexity, more dependencies. The balance is uncertain. The outcome is unknown. But the effort is necessary. There's a concept in information theory called redundancy. It's the idea that to preserve information reliably, you need multiple copies, multiple forms, multiple channels of transmission. If one copy is lost or corrupted, the others remain. The ancient world understood this intuitively. They didn't have information theory, but they had experience with loss, with the fragility of memory, with the difficulty of maintaining knowledge across generations. So they encoded their mathematical understanding in multiple forms. In oral tradition, yes, but also in practice, in architecture, in art, in ritual. The same knowledge expressed in different ways, each reinforcing the others. The proportions of a temple encode geometric principles. The ritual performed in that temple, the processions, the alignments to celestial events, these enact astronomical knowledge. The stories told about the temple, the myths of its foundation and purpose, these embed mathematical and cosmological concepts in narrative form. If one channel fails, if the stories are forgotten or the rituals abandoned, the knowledge might still persist in the physical structure, in the proportions and alignments, waiting to be recognized by someone with the eyes to see it. This is redundancy. This is information preservation through diversity of encoding. And it worked. We've recovered some of what was lost, not through finding texts which mostly didn't survive, but through analyzing the structures, through measuring the proportions, through reconstructing the astronomy that guided the builders. The knowledge was there all along, frozen in stone, waiting for us to develop the tools and perspective to recognize it. But it's an inefficient method. Much is lost. Much is ambiguous. We can see that ancient structures encode mathematical knowledge, but we often can't determine exactly what the builders knew or how they thought about it. We're reverse engineering from the products without access to the process. Still, it's better than nothing, and it's a lesson for us. If we want our knowledge to persist, we need to encode it in multiple forms at multiple scales, in ways that can survive the loss of specific technologies or institutions. We need texts, yes, but also practical traditions. We need digital archives, but also physical ones. We need formal education, but also informal transmission. We need specialized knowledge held by experts, but also broad understanding distributed through the culture. Redundancy, diversity, resilience. The ancients, perhaps without articulating it this way, built resilient knowledge systems. And when we recover even fragments of what they knew, it's because that resilience worked, at least partially. Now imagine yourself standing in a museum, looking at the Ashango bone behind glass. The small, unassuming, easy to walk past without noticing. But you stop. You look at the notches, the 3 columns, the patterns, and you feel something. Connection, maybe. A sense of reaching across 25,000 years to touch the mind of another human being. Someone who also wondered, who also sought pattern, who also felt the deep human need to understand and to record. They're gone. Their language is lost. Their culture is unknown. We don't even know what they called themselves. But this remains. This little piece of bone with its careful carvings, its evidence of thought, of intention, of understanding. It's one of the oldest mathematical objects we have. And it's a reminder that mathematics isn't new, isn't the product of the last few thousand years of civilization. It's old, deep, fundamental to the human experience. When you count, you're doing something humans have done for at least 40,000 years, probably far longer. When you recognize a pattern, you're exercising a cognitive capacity that's been selected for over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. When you wonder about the structure of the cosmos, you're asking questions that have been asked as long as humans have been able to ask questions. You're part of a tradition, a long, unbroken, mostly unrecorded tradition of human curiosity and understanding. And that's worth feeling, worth recognizing, worth honoring. The story we've explored tonight is, in one sense, about mathematics. But in a deeper sense, it's about continuity. It's about the ways knowledge persists, changes, disappears, and reemerges. It's about the long human project of understanding the world and our place in it. That project has no end. We're still working on it. We've learned things our ancestors didn't know. We've lost things they knew. We've rediscovered some of what was lost. We've invented new methods and new fields of inquiry. But we haven't finished. We never will. Because the universe is vast and complex and mysterious, and no matter how much we learn, there's always more. Always deeper patterns. Always new questions. The ancients knew this. They built their monuments not as final statements but as beginnings, as foundations for future generations to build upon. They encoded their knowledge in forms they hoped would endure, recognizing that they couldn't control what would happen after they were gone. But they could at least try to pass something forward. And it worked. Not perfectly, not completely, but here we are, thousands of years later, still finding their messages, still learning from their insights, still connected to them through the mathematics they developed and we've inherited. That connection is profound. It transcends language, culture, time. It's a connection of mind to mind, of understanding to understanding. They looked at the moon and counted its cycles. We look at the moon and understand it as a satellite in orbit, but we still use those cycles, still divide our time by them. They arranged stones to mark the solstice. We understand the solstice as the axial tilt of the Earth, but we still mark it, still recognize it as significant, still feel the turning of the year in our bones the way they did. The knowledge has been deepened, formalized, expressed in new languages and new notations. But at its core, it's the same knowledge, the same patterns, the same cosmos, and we're still discovering it, still exploring the mathematical landscape that the ancients began to map, still finding new territories, new connections, new depths. Perhaps, thousands of years from now, people will look back at our time the way we look back at the Paleolithic. They'll marvel at what we knew. They'll puzzle over what we didn't. They'll find our artifacts and try to reconstruct our understanding, our worldview, our mathematics. And they'll be part of the same tradition, the same long conversation, the same human project of making sense of the patterns we find in the world and in the sky and in our minds. That's the real story. Not the specific equations or theorems, though those are important, but the continuity, the connection, the tradition of curiosity and understanding that binds us to our ancestors and to our descendants in a chain that extends into the deep past and the deep future. We're links in that chain, temporary, fragile, but part of something much larger and more enduring than any individual life. So where does this leave us? Here at the end of our journey through the mathematical deep past. It leaves us with mystery, with questions that can't be fully answered, with evidence that's suggestive but not conclusive, with a sense of vastness, of knowledge gained and lost and never fully recovered. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe certainty would be disappointing. Maybe the value is in the exploration itself, in the willingness to look at the evidence with fresh eyes, to question assumptions, to imagine possibilities that the standard narrative doesn't accommodate. What if the first human culture used math we still don't understand? What if the notched bones and carved stones contain numerical sequences, geometric principles, mathematical relationships that we haven't fully decoded, that represent ways of thinking about number and pattern that are different from our modern approach but equally valid, equally sophisticated? We can't prove it, but we can't disprove it either. The evidence is ambiguous enough to allow for multiple interpretations, And the interpretation that ancient people were more mathematically sophisticated than we've given them credit for fits the evidence at least as well as the interpretation that they were primitive. The choice between interpretations isn't just academic. It shapes how we think about ourselves, about our history, about the trajectory of human knowledge. If we believe that we've steadily progressed from ignorance to enlightenment, that narrative supports a certain view of the present and future. We're at the top or close to it, and things will keep getting better. But if we believe that knowledge is cyclical, that it's gained and lost, that what we know is partly rediscovered from earlier times, that narrative is more humbling. It suggests that we're not at the top but somewhere in the middle, that we've recovered some of what was lost but not all, that we're vulnerable to our own losses, our own collapses. Which narrative is correct? Probably neither, fully. The truth is likely more complex, more nuanced, incorporating elements of both progress and recovery, invention and remembrance. But the question is worth asking, because how we answer it shapes how we value the past, how we approach the present, how we plan for the future. If the past was primitive, we can ignore it, learn from our own time, our own innovations, and move forward without looking back. But if the past was sophisticated, if ancient people knew things we've forgotten, then the past becomes a resource, a library of knowledge, much of it lost or hidden, but some of it recoverable if we look carefully enough, if we're willing to recognize intelligence and sophistication in unfamiliar forms. The evidence we've explored tonight suggests the latter. It suggests that our ancestors were far more capable than the standard narrative acknowledges, that they developed mathematical understanding early and maintained it, imperfectly but persistently, through tens of thousands of years of human history. This doesn't mean they had computers or spacecraft or modern physics. It means they had observation, pattern recognition, geometric intuition, astronomical knowledge, all developed through patient attention to the world around them and transmitted through cultural practices that we've only partially preserved. And it means that when we do mathematics today, we're not creating ex nihilo. We're working in a tradition, extending and refining knowledge that has roots far deeper than we usually acknowledge. The notched bones from 40,000 years ago are our ancestors' contributions to this tradition. The megalithic structures, the geometric art, the astronomical alignments, all of these are chapters in a book that we're still writing. And the book has no end. Because mathematics is infinite. There are always more patterns to discover, more relationships to understand, more depths to explore. The ancients explored their territories. We explore ours. Future generations will explore theirs. But we're all exploring the same landscape, the same fundamental mathematical reality that underlies the physical world, that structures space and time and matter and energy, that manifests in the spiral of galaxies and the branching of trees and the proportions we find beautiful. That landscape is the same for everyone, across all times and cultures. Access to it doesn't depend on technology or writing or institutions, though those help. It depends only on curiosity, attention, and the willingness to think abstractly about pattern and number. Our ancestors had those qualities. We have them. Future generations will have them. And so the tradition continues, the long human exploration of mathematical truth, stretching from the deep past into the indefinite future. This is the legacy. Not specific theorems, though those are preserved. Not particular calculations, though those are transmitted. But the tradition itself. The practice of mathematical thinking. The recognition that the world is patterned. That the patterns can be understood. That understanding them is worth the effort. The ancients gave us this. They began the tradition, or they maintained it from even earlier beginnings, and they passed it forward through countless generations, through languages we no longer speak and cultures we can barely imagine, through dark ages and collapses and disruptions, until it reached us. And now it's our turn. We receive it. We add to it. We pass it forward to the next generation as best we can with the tools and methods we have, hoping that something of what we've learned and understood will survive, will reach people in the future who will look back at us the way we look back at the carvers of the Ashango bone, with curiosity, with respect, with the recognition that we were, all of us, part of the same endeavor, the same long human project of making sense of the mathematical structure of reality. That project is ongoing. It's unfinished. It will remain unfinished as long as there are humans to pursue it. And that's not a problem. That's the point. The pursuit is the value. The exploration is the reward. The tradition is the treasure. So when you see a full moon tonight, or tomorrow night, or whenever the sky is clear, take a moment. Think about the fact that humans have been watching that moon, tracking its cycles, noticing its patterns, for at least 40,000 years. Think about the notches carved into bone by someone who lived 25,000 years ago, someone who also watched the moon, also counted, also wondered. Think about the continuity, the tradition, the long chain of human minds, stretching back into the darkness, connected by the shared practice of observing, counting, understanding. You're part of that chain, and so am I, and so is everyone who's ever looked at the sky and wondered, who's ever noticed a pattern and tried to understand it, who's ever used number or geometry or calculation to make sense of the world. We're all mathematicians in the deepest sense, all explorers of the same infinite landscape, all participants in the same ancient tradition. And that tradition, that long human conversation about pattern and number and form, that's what we've been exploring tonight. Not just the specific artifacts or the particular cultures, but the underlying continuity, the deep human drive to understand, to find order, to connect with something larger than ourselves through the language of mathematics. It's a language we've been speaking for at least 40,000 years, probably much longer, and we'll keep speaking it in new dialects and new forms, for as long as there are humans to speak it. That's the real mystery, not whether ancient people knew specific theorems, but why we're driven to explore mathematics at all. Why pattern recognition matters to us. Why understanding feels like a fundamental need, not just a practical tool. Maybe it's because we're part of the pattern. Maybe recognizing the mathematical structure of the cosmos is, in some sense, the cosmos recognizing itself. Maybe our minds are the universe becoming conscious of its own structure, its own order, its own mathematical nature. That's a thought to fall asleep to. The idea that when you do mathematics, when you recognize a pattern, when you understand a relationship, you're participating in something cosmic, something fundamental, something that connects you to the deepest structure of reality and to every other human who's ever had the same experience of understanding. Sleep well. And when you wake, the patterns will still be there, waiting to be explored.